My friends, there are plenty of dessert and beverage options, so go ahead and grab something, and we'll begin sort of the theology portion here in just a moment. But I'm super excited you are all here. And yeah, this is excellent. Thanks for being here. All right, my friends, just to respect the time, because it is, a long movie, and I want to give us all the opportunity to be able to watch it. Actually, I better do this now. I'm going to set a 20-minute timer on my talking. You think I'm kidding? Because I could go all night. But let me start. It's I think I'm 6 or 7 years old. And it's the first time that my mom's letting me stay up. We're watching something on TV. She's excited and I'm confused because I'm like, what are we doing? And then it happens, that sort of horn fanfare as it sort of hits your ears every time, and the scroll. Now for me, my first movie was Return of the Jedi. Hence the black with a little bit of white, right? Like, the Luke Skywalker moment, right? Yeah, not Sith, but Jedi. And I'm not going to lie, my favorite character at the time was probably the Ewok, because what kid who is about 7 years old doesn't want a giant stuffed teddy bear that walks, right? And I thought, yes, that is absolutely amazing. And then I actually saw the Ewok spin-off series, and I thought that was Star Wars. I was confused for a long time of what that was. I'm going to take this off because I'm already warm. But it was like an introduction to something just mythical and beyond my own imagination. Yeah, I have the robes too, okay? Just so we're clear. This is, you go all out, right? So, but it was the first time that I just was opened to this awesome sort of alternate world, this other universe. And over, time and time again, as the technology changed, my family was that family that went out and got the Star Wars movies in each of their forms, right? So VHS, yes. The first DVDs, the massive record players, yes. The Blu-ray and everything that sort of came on and on and on after it, even to the point of now this is my Amazon account where I have it downloadable so I can download the digital version, yes. Right, that has become just something of a connection to my childhood, but at the same time sort of opening my eyes to just the idea of storytelling, the idea of just kind of entering into something that has many, many different parts. Another story. I think I'm in 3rd grade, and my teacher, for whatever reason, I think is trying to teach us to be calm. And I remember the activity was to imagine an apple. And the teacher just invited us to sort of imaginative, think of an apple and think of all of those different parts of an apple. And at some point, I just remember feeling this awesome moment of peace. And I think that, to me, if I look back and try to find a single moment in which I fell in love with spirituality and the idea that there was something real, right? We all know that Star Wars isn't real in the sense of this table being real, or even this sense of something that we would necessarily. I'm not going to find a Wookiee in my lifetime that came from the planet Kashyyyk, right? No matter how hard I think, maybe something like that exists, but it's on accident. It is not because we have what philosophers would call true knowledge of it, right? But peace, love, and sort of entering into sort of this relationship with something beyond myself, it was real. And it was sort of these two loves that began to grow in me as I began sort of my youthfulness, young adulthood, and ultimately to what would lead me to the Society of Jesus. So this love, this sense of recognizing that these things could be in concert with one another was something that I always sort of knew intrinsically. It didn't hurt that my first year of the novitiate, we played a lot of tabletop role-playing games. For the uninitiated, you might associate them with Dungeons and Dragons. But the tabletop role-playing game we had actually was based on the Star Wars universe. And so we had all the rules and basically the way that you could literally role-play Star Wars on tabletop role-playing, and it was awesome. I was a Jedi there too. But the more I thought about it, and the more I continued to think about it, I think there's an interesting foil that Star Wars can provide us if we want to think theologically about a thing, and if we actually want to kind of go into this idea of Star Wars in its own right. And so today I'm going to talk about sort of, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I got 5 theological ideas I hope to cover in 15 minutes. Here we go. First, one of the reasons I think I ultimately chose the Jesuits, right, falling in love with Jedi, falling in love with spirituality, is that I think Jesuits and Jedi are probably the most similar of religious orders to sort of Jedi and the mythos of Star Wars. As we all know that, maybe we don't all know this, but Jedi have a particular color based on their skills and their sort of their temperament and their attributes of the color that they get for their lightsaber. In fact, Mace Windu's is purple in universe because he has a unique form of lightsaber fighting. In reality, it happens to be that Samuel L. Jackson wanted a purple lightsaber and made George Lucas make him one, which I think is equally cool, but still kind of a lot of fun, and I've always been partial to purple. So I think my lightsaber color is also purple. But it's not the only thing in my life that is color-coded. Here's a rosary. This is one of the paracord rosaries you can kind of make or whatever, and it's green. And in the same way, you have to sort of attack or look at how to use this spiritual tool in the same way that you have to use a lightsaber. A lightsaber can't just simply be wielded by anyone, right? You have to be in tune with the Force and understand how to sort of recognize its strengths, its limitations, what it can be used for and what it shouldn't be used for, in the same way that a rosary, I think, has the same thing, right? So it shouldn't be used for as a weapon of slapping your younger siblings. I learned that lesson the hard way. But it can be used as a way of sort of entering into something different, right? And in a lot of ways, the Jedi weapon of the lightsaber is really dependent on sort of the intentions, what's going on, the user, as well as sort of the gift of the tool itself. And I think the same could be said of the rosary, right? And so for me, this sense that Jesuits walked around with rosaries, that we kind of, like enter into this deeper sort of like mythical status within the church, sometimes of our own creating, sometimes legitimately. There's just sort of this wonderful way of like combining the two. In fact, when I was, looking at religious orders, the Jesuits actually was competing with like this fringe radical site that if you Googled the word Jesuit, like the first couple of responses were legitimate Jesuit web pages, but like the third or fourth one down in 2005 was how the Jesuits secretly controlled everything. Naturally, as someone looking for, a vocation, the one page that I went to first was not the vocations page, it was that last page, that fifth page that basically said, wait, we're in charge of everything? If you've ever watched Jesuits try to decide where they're going to go for dinner and how many cars they're going to take, I can assure you we are not in charge of anything that miraculous. But that sense that we often go in twos, that Ignatius sent his men out 2 by 2 into the world, and often there was always this sense of camaraderie, that there was also this wonderful sense of like hierarchy and all of those things that sort of, I don't know, it just sort of appealed to me both in the Society of Jesus and in the Jesuits. So I think there are a lot of similarities. There are, of course, a lot of differences, no matter how hard I try. And despite the number of times I go into like a grocery market and I have that moment where I do this, because the doors are automatic, it's not actually me, right? Even though I still do it every time, and whether I'm with people or not, true to God, I just go, I've moved that door, right? That is a thing that I do, and I know I'm weird. But the other reality is that I think unlike the Jedi, the modern Jesuit does not necessarily limit you to sort of this light or dark trope, but it does sort of help us recognize the good and the evil spirit, right? That there is a lot of things going on in the world, and a way to sort of enter into that dichotomy. How do we discern that spirit? How do we trust that spirit? How do we learn that spirit? Right? And I love the similarity in that way. On top of that, but as theology has shifted, so has my understanding of this relationship with Star Wars and my being a Jesuit. I mean, even language has shifted within our church, right? It used to be, when someone said, "The Lord be with you," the response naturally was, "And also with you." Right, and there's probably, that's where Lucas gets that initial theme of the Force be with you, and then people are supposed to say, and also with you, right? So the question I have for you, I just a show of hands, what is the right answer? If I say the Force be with you, what is the right answer? And also with you, raise your hand. And with your spirit. It is in fact, and also with you. And here's why, and this is the beginning of the differentiation between our faith and the faith, what is true in the Star Wars universe is the Star Wars doesn't have a sense of spirit. Now, it does have a sense of the Force. The Force is something that exists, that it's tangible, depending on whether or not you want to acknowledge midichlorians or not. That's episode 1, in case anybody's playing along at home, what I'm referencing. In that movie, The Phantom Menace, they kind of bring in this idea of midichlorians, and they actually don't do anything with it in the actual movie series, so I'm not going to either. But the idea that the Force is something that we can somehow measure, that we can somehow experience, distinguishes it from this idea of spirit. The idea of spirit in the Star Wars universe doesn't necessarily exist, right? Like even the Force ghosts of the Jedi that happen at later points within the series, that's a different concept than I think this idea of spirit or pneumos, that thing that is within us and entirely an essential component of us, but it is not something that we can sort of manipulate, right? Good users of the Force, the Jedi, use the Force to sort of bring about peace and to bring people forward together, to help meet an end, to mediate peace and whatever that looks like. And the Sith might use it for destructive ends, but in both cases, the implicit understanding of the Force is that it is malleable. I can control it. I somehow can wield the Force. Our understanding of spirit doesn't follow that same sort of convention, right? That the spirit is something that we can participate in, the spirit we can respond to, but it is the Spirit's action as part of the triune God that we're responding to. It is not something that I can control. I cannot will the Spirit to sort of follow my actions. I can discern the Spirit. I can listen to the Spirit, but I cannot will the Spirit. So in that way, we want to be conscious that, there are some significant and really important differences between sort of the theology of Star Wars and our own theology. But it does help us ask really interesting questions. And let's take the question, for example, of canon. Now, as great Star Wars fans, I'm sure if you're a certain generation, you recognize there were books and novellas and comic books. I mean, this whole expanded universe of Star Wars memorabilia and participation. And then once George Lucas sold the rights to Star Wars to Disney, they kind of came out and said, no, the only thing that is canon are the movies and those sort of live-action produced things, or the things that we have sort of said make legitimate to the canon of Star Wars. Well, if you know anything about your Christian history, there's a certain role that there's a way that there's an arbiter of canon that ultimately has come down to help us give our sacred scriptures. And even with that, there's not total agreement on what is canon, or even what is that relationship between sort of the authors of canon, interpreters of canon, and those non-canonical things, right? If you study any theology at all, at some point, you're going to come into contact with extra-canonical or non-canonical sources of stories about Christ. Maybe that's the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, or the infancy narrative of Thomas, or the Gospel of Thomas, right? Or even something that is sort of held within the canon but isn't canon in of itself is if you have ever recognized the synoptic tradition, right? That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We know that those three Gospels are intimately linked. The scripture scholars believe that Mark was sort of the first gospel written, and that Matthew and Luke had some sort of version of Mark and utilized it. And a popular theory within scripture scholars is this idea of a Q source, that there's a second source lost to history that served as a canonical source to give Matthew and Luke information not contained in Mark, but is somehow contained in both of those gospels. And it's one way of trying to explain how there is so much similarity, right? So even though something isn't canon, but it is still sort of recognized as part of the canon because it eventually becomes part of that. Well, I mean, if you are a fan of The Mandalorian, this is the May, by the way, or if you're a fan of some of the other series that have come out on Star Wars, you recognize that as of late, one of their favorite tricks is to suddenly bring in what was part of that expanded universe prior to sort of declaring what was canon and tell some of those same stories, right? So the source itself isn't canon, but somehow what eventually makes it into canon is somehow got a source that is beyond that. And I think that's a wonderful way of sort of like, looking at, well, what does canonical mean? Right? And even what is canon today, right? So this idea that George Lucas somehow had a complete idea of the Star Wars epic. There are people who will defend this up and down, even though some of the earliest, interviews with George Lucas have clearly stated that, no, we kind of started with episode 4, and it wasn't even called episode 4 then, and we kind of moved forward and did these other things. Right? So how we treat all of the expanded universe that comes through the movies themselves, right? Even if we just focus on the movies, how are we in relationship with that idea of canon, and how are we in relationship with that idea in general? I just want to give this sense. I forgot to mention, I have to be truly grateful for this book. It's called The Theology of Star Wars, The Theology of the Star Wars Universe, edited by Benjamin Espinoza. It's a great text. I've read a lot of theology textbooks in my life, and this is actually written. It's got a lot of different theological authors who go through different aspects of using modern theology and theological techniques to sort of apply to this idea of Star Wars. And I don't know if it's because of my familiarity with theology or my familiarity with Star Wars, but it's the easiest textbook I've ever read. It's like, oh my God, this is amazing, right? But when we kind of look at this concept of canon, suddenly we're now able to look at our own scriptures, our own tradition, and be able to say, oh, yeah, there's a lot going on here. This sense of tradition for us Catholics is an important component of what we preach and teach and how we understand the world, right? Like a great question for Catholics is, what are Mary's parents' name? Anna and Joachim, right? Like we all know that. Is that in the Bible? No, right? But somehow that tradition has an important role, and like for example, tradition says that Thomas the Apostle makes it to India, right? We don't have any written record of that. Yet we do have Thomas Christians who trace their history to India. So even though we can't prove in like a modern historical in the science of historicity prove that he was there, we also have these other sort of effects that he was there. And so tradition is actually giving us an important tool, an important lens by which we can then see something more deeply about both the history of our church and its development. So this conversation of what does Scripture actually look like, I think, is one that's worth it. Another idea that we see a lot in the Star Wars universe is the idea of master and apprentice, right? In the expanded sort of Star Wars universe, that whole idea of Padawan, you're a Padawan learner, and then you're a knight in training, and then you're a Jedi master, right? And it's another parallel to, I think, the Jesuit training, right? I'm a Padawan learner. I was a novice. I took vows, and I became a Jedi Knight. Now I'm going to go to tertianship beginning June 8th for 2 months this summer and 2 months next summer. And then after that, maybe I'll be invited to Jedi Master, but on the council I will not sit. I mean, I don't know. But whatever it happens to be, there's this sort of sense in which there's a lot of training, and we call the priest who is in charge of the novices the novice master, right? So novice and apprentice. There really is within the Christian tradition, but in a lot of religious traditions, this idea of master and novice. And I think it speaks to the idea of a physical learned relationship. That we could do a lot of book learning, right? And if we look at the first movies, there's clearly the Jedi Temple on Coruscant has got a lot of book learning, but there's also something really important about being in that dynamic relationship, right? In that dynamic sense of passing on information. And then we could even go more deeply into this idea of heroes, or this idea of, what happens when a hero of ours is giving a bad example. If you're a fan of either the Rebels or its precursor, the Clone Wars cartoon series, Anakin gets a Padawan. Spoiler alert, it doesn't go well, right? And we might argue he's not a great Jedi Master to his Padawan, and I love that storyline because it sort of carries on a number of different things. It's not in the movie, so I won't obsess on it, but I think it's just a wonderful idea of here we can see depicted in film this sort of real dynamic of relationships in this world and its complexity, as well as being able to sort of analyze it. If we use the tool of sort of, religious, sociological understanding, we can kind of both see how that master and student dichotomy has its strengths and weaknesses, and we can also apply that to within our Christian tradition, right? That sense of master and apprentice. There is a strength there, but there are also legitimate weaknesses, and I think it just sort of gives us an insight. Sometimes when we analyze a thing that is important to us but doesn't sort of have such grave or life or spiritual life and death things, that's my 20 minutes. I'm going to wrap this up. When we don't have the spiritual life and death reality associated with it, I think it gives us permission to be critical, to be thinking, and all of that. The last thing I want to talk on is just this idea of what happens when the mythos becomes self-aware. And for us Christians, that becomes, in some ways, Catholic social teaching is an example of our tradition becoming aware of itself and having to somehow reflect on itself. both what does it mean to do justice in the Catholic tradition, right? And we use Catholic social teaching by way of explaining that and sort of using our history, our tradition, and all that to kind of give us these principles of Catholic social teaching. And then somehow to judge ourselves against that and to recognize that sometimes in our history as Catholics and Christians, we have actually failed our own standard of being moral or being just, right? There's a sense of self-awareness that of our limitations and our reality of entering into that. And I think that's a goal for us to always be that critical and being aware of that. Well, what about Star Wars? Has it become self-aware, and can it be self-aware in a way that it begins to recognize that the mythos and the story it told in A New Hope, Return of the Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi had limitations, and that in the sequel trilogy there was at least some attempts to be aware of those limitations to try to deal with that, to somehow not necessarily change the tradition, but to at least be in conversation with the tradition. Are there different ways of doing Jedi, right? And so to some extent that might be what happens at the end of the last movie, that the sense is like, no, being Jedi was one way of doing like Force and all that, but maybe there's a different way to do that. And that wonderful sense of seeing maybe the sequel trilogy as an evolution, not just simply of how to be entertained by the Star Wars mythos, but actually a self-commentary. What is it trying to deal with? So yes, it covers the same themes, right? In The Force Awakens, we blow up another Death Star-looking thing, only it's bigger, it's planet-wide, and it destroys more planets at once. We heard that story, right? But maybe there's also something else in terms of commentary and being aware of the Force tradition that we can look at and go a little bit more deeply into these sequels. That's what I hope this theology of the Force can help us do, is to take something that we love and actually sort of wrestle with it. And I don't pretend to say that there's a right answer here. In fact, I think that's part of the gift of Scripture scholarship in itself, is these are sometimes our best guesses and our best attempts at this. This is if we give, as Ignatius of Loyola would give us, that sense of what's called the annotation 22. Let's put the best possible interpretation on what's happening. Let's actually try to be in community and say, well, I disagree with you, but that's not the end of the world. I might really prefer sort of the original series or the original 3 movies, and that's it. That's my jam. That's where I end, and I'm okay with that. And I would be like, you're wrong, but hey, no, I'm kidding. But then that there can be the sense that we can go a little bit more deeply. This most recent episode, the season of The Mandalorian, by the way, season 3, was rife with spiritual images. I won't spoil it because it's too close to the premiere. It's too close to having been out. I got to wait, I think, about 7 or 8 months before people would. Most people, if you were going to watch the season 3 of Mandalorian because it meant something to you, you're already going to watch it. But in the fall, I can guarantee you there will be a homily on what's going on, what's going on in that episode as we move forward. So there's an awesome movie waiting to be watched, and I think we should watch it. But I thank you for just hearing me out on this theology thing. I hope you are able to take something away and, as we move forward, maybe have some more conversations about theological themes and how we understand Star Wars. Are there any quick questions before I put the movie on? Not any quick ones. All right, friends, the Force be with you.